doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
We know that investment in renewable energy is critical to ensure projects are developed and come online with necessary speed. However, there is a significant gap between the investment needed and what is currently coming into the continent. How can we increase this investment while also ensuring that it goes towards responsible and sustainable projects to provide a true counter-narrative to conceptions of Africa as a place solely for extraction, and to ensure that African workers, communities, and companies directly benefit from Africa's riches? Hubert, you have the floor.
Thank you, Francis, for the question, and Mary for hosting us, and your tireless and unwavering leadership over this long period of time. We really, on the continent, really do appreciate that. Regarding the question, Francis, look, as we know, Africa needs to mobilize $3 trillion of investment for its nationally determined contributions by 2030, while the world only mobilized about 2.8 trillion in the last 20 years. That's the year 2000 to the year 2020, of which only 2% of that came to Africa from a global pool. What does that mean? That really means that Africa needs to mobilize more investment in the next 8 years than the world has mobilized in the last 20 years. So there's no question we need to co-create and implement future-fit business models and platforms to make mobilizing private capital at scale for African nationally determined contributions and the just energy transition the expectation, not the exception. Look, really the question is, what's the route to market that can mobilize and de-risk private capital at scale and deploy that capital at speed to meet our $3 trillion worth of nationally determined contribution investments and support our just energy transition needs by 2030. From the domestic African asset owners perspective, we have 3 major initiatives as the African asset owner community, which have the overarching goal to design and deliver greater public-private finance mandate alignment and more catalytic private investment pathways that fast track and scale private capital's participation in the green transition, implemented through institutional investor public partnerships, such as the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank. So, first of all, our domestic institutional investment platform, as I mentioned, is the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank. And this is part of the solution, which is an African Union convened and supported African institutional investor-led global finance initiative to catalyze private capital for Africa's green transition in the run-up to COP27 in Africa and beyond. So this particular platform recognizes Africa's green finance market is suboptimal, fragmented, and lacks platforms to mobilize institutional capital at scale. So the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank is essentially an investor in and manager of African green infrastructure assets and works to mobilize other private sector capital, crowding in additional finance, not displacing other investors. We primarily look to invest in wind, solar, waste recycling and biomass energy production, agriculture, water and forestry, energy efficiency, grids, electrification of cooking and transport, and green supply chains and digital infrastructure assets. As the largest consortium of African and global institutional investors, we're really committed to being innovative and building and strengthening the African green infrastructure market and not simply serving it. Secondly, in terms of the things that we are actually doing to address your question, Francis, is that, you would have heard at COP26, the International Energy Agency stating that the financial conditions for a rapid deployment of clean energy in Africa and emerging markets and the creation of new regulatory frameworks that will allow the mobilization and deployment of private capital at scale and at speed is one of the defining challenges of our time. With that in mind, at COP26, we announced the Model Law for Institutional Investor Public Partnerships Initiative, which is a collaboration led by the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Global Asset Owners Council out of New York, and being driven by the global law firm DLA Piper. So this particular model law aims to solve that particular problem I just stated, and really introduce and enable the use of a newly designed infrastructure investment procurement regulation and framework directly between governments and domestic and global institutional investors for green and net zero infrastructure investment programs and projects, both domestically and across the continent. And that particular model law is something that we're going to be launching at COP27 in Egypt. And third and finally, in terms of the initiatives, democratizing, and this is how we enfranchise, our colleagues and our workers and our communities. Third and finally, democratizing and increasing Africa's access to the $10 trillion per annum and growing global green economy and their value chains for African and made in African finished goods, not the traditional historic discriminatory raw materials export trade practice. But in this respect, we're really focusing on this initiative on mobilizing and working with the global pension funds and sovereign wealth funds on African continental free trade area supportive strategies to work with their portfolio companies to ensure compliance and reporting as part of their ESG commitments to increase Africa's integration and share of their global value chains for value-added goods, as I mentioned before, especially those that leverage the African continental free trade area and Sustainable Development Goal number 10 on inequality, aligned with platforms such as the Task Force on Inequality-Related Financial Disclosures, patronized by global institutional and faith-based investors committed to leveraging Sustainable Development Goal 17 on North-South capital mobilization partnerships, all of which will be central to the just energy transition on the continent.
I have the honor of asking you the last question to the panel. So let's think about immediate steps. COP27 is to be held this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and it is approaching very quickly. What should the legacy of this critical global forum be for the African continent? And also, what would you like to see investors and governments commit to at COP27 in relation to energy transition investments and projects in Africa? Hubert, can I have a response?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for that question, Francis. Look, I think the bottom line here is that we know that governments around the world, development finance institutions, civil society, and many of us in the finance community recognize that there's no single pathway that can be achieved to get to net zero without the exponential increase of institutional capital, that's private institutional capital. So we therefore think that raising the investor agenda and a dedicated institutional investor focus, as opposed to just a finance focus, is very important for us at COP27 and going into the big stock take for COP28 in the UAE. We would like to see many things, but in terms of commitments, particularly, there are sort of 5 quick areas that I'm going to go through at pace. First of all is the model law that I mentioned, the model law on institutional investor public partnerships. We'd like to see that embraced as a key net zero private capital mobilization pathway. Secondly, we would like to see tax incentives for investors investing in African green infrastructure discussed and advanced. Tax incentives deductibility to encourage greater investment into green infrastructure from the G20 and global institutional investment community. We think that that's possible. That's what was used to stimulate the venture capital trust market in the UK and the municipal bond market in the US. So let's incentivize more capital to come in at scale. We'd also like to see a recalculation of the unmet vintage promised 100 billion adaptation and mitigation finance to a more realistic number. And we'd like the appropriately positioned proportion of that to actually go through the likes of the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank so that it can catalyze institutional pension and sovereign fund money from Africa. We'd like to see multilateral development banks become more aligned with the nationally determined contributions in terms of their business models through more sophisticated de-risking business models rather than traditional subsistence style loans. And finally, global market access, as I mentioned before. We'd like to be able to see global market access and a consensus around procurement around Africa's access to this 10 trillion and growing annual green global industrial economy for finished goods and green technologies manufactured in Africa under the African Continental Free Trade Area as part of investors' ESG and SDG 10 reporting commitments to address Africa's historic marginalization from the value chains and associated systemic commercial market access inequalities. So in one sentence, and to conclude, as universal asset owners, we need the whole market to do well. That's the message and legacy we'd like to see from COP27. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.